And I'd heard of Fred Brown, and my first thought was I'd heard about him and that he supposedly was a cowboy. Being from Okanagan County, I know what a real cowboy is, and I kind of thought he was probably some California software guy that made a bunch of money and then bought some
cowboy hats.
Yeah, some hats. All hat, no cattle, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Well, here we are with another edition of the Ben and Sway Show. Today we've got John Pariseau with us. We're going to talk about what he's been doing in the Spokane area.
You want to talk about me?
Yeah.
It's my least favorite subject.
Well, we're going to
take about 30 seconds.
We're going to talk about what you've been doing in the Spokane area, some of the projects you've done, some of the things that you're involved with, a lot of startups and different people. What do you see coming on the horizon for Spokane and the region? There's been a lot of changes here.
Well, maybe to talk about where we are now, we could back up and talk about where we've been and
yeah, absolutely.
What I know about the past of Spokane. Because I moved here in '95, come from a farming family, and I actually commuted back and forth to the farm in central Washington on a weekly basis until 2002.
Like right near Brewster? Or is that,
Brewster area.
Yeah.
And so...
What drew you to Spokane?
Education.
Yeah.
I had 5 kids. At the time I had 4.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife, like the day we got married, she's a surgeon's daughter from Wenatchee.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know anything about the dynamics of central Washington, in Wenatchee, if you go north, you go to Chelan, but
right.
past Chelan is like Crazyville, so nobody ever goes past Chelan.
Right.
So I drug my poor wife past Chelan to Brewster, and 15 minutes after our first kid was born, she was like, "What are we going to do about education?" And I was like, "I don't know. You and I both went to public school, and it's like meat and potatoes." But by the time my kids got in school, it was obvious that public education had changed, and it didn't change for the better. So to make a long story short, we ended up moving over here, putting our kids in Cataldo, and I did the commute. Now we own some real estate, etc. But what's interesting is to talk to guys that made it through the 80s here.
Yeah.
One of our tenants is Russ Page, who's an architect, and he's a Montana State guy. Mm-hmm. And he gravitated to Spokane in the 70s, and he said mid-80s we starved out. He had to move to Seattle for a few years just to put beans on the table, and as soon as he could come back, he could.
Yeah.
So you see things like Kendall Yards.
Yeah.
And that's property that used to be a big railroad yard. It had environmental problems. Marshall Chesron took it on. Mm-hmm. And before that, it was Metropolitan Mortgage.
Yeah, remember that.
But it's interesting to see, a guy like Jim Frank, who's I've only met him once, but I know enough about him to know he's really a pro-Spokane guy. Mm-hmm. The third owner took it on and has turned it into a real eye-popping thing. So you talk about what's happening today and going forward, you got to, have respect for the guys that made it through these tough times.
Well, I remember hearing stories about, the Davenport Hotel, and that Spokane was a big deal, like turn of the last century.
Yeah.
1800s, 1900. There were some presidents that came through
Huge
here.
growth.
And it was right on the edge of all the natural resources, right? So you had the forests up north and
Silver
east
Valley.
and west. You had the mining. You had the
water
farming.
Power.
You had all the water power and all the hydro that was going on. Mm-hmm. And then in the World's Fair, I think that was what, 74?
74. Yeah.
And then,
were you born by then?
Not quite.
I remember going to the World's Fair.
But when I was a kid, it was the whole Riverfront Park and everything. It was still pretty sparkly.
Yeah.
And
when I was a kid, it wasn't.
Yeah.
So.
And then it's now like we've kind of gone through these troughs, and now Spokane has some really interesting things happening, and I think it has to do with the ability to communicate very rapidly, to be different places while being here, video conferencing. And we've seen a number of firms that might be Silicon Valley or Seattle based that go, boy, real estate's not as expensive. You can get really high quality employees for what in most places would be reasonable. Commutes, although there's some spots that make it difficult to get through Spokane, it's nothing compared to the Bay Area or Seattle,
right,
or even others. And so I think that's bring the people like you described that were out doing something someplace else, whether it was Denver, Salt Lake, LA, Seattle. And boy, it'd sure be nice to get back to Spokane.
So again, talking about the past, so when I punched out of the farming deal and I was looking for a business to buy here, people kept telling me, well, you're a farmer, don't you know Fred Brown? He's a cowboy. Like all hick type people have some kind of secret lodge where they gather. And I'd heard of Fred Brown, and my first thought was I'd heard about him and that he supposedly was a cowboy. Being from Okanagan County, I know what a real cowboy is, and I kind of thought he was probably some California software guy that made a bunch of money and then bought some
cowboy hats.
Yeah, some hats. All hat, no cattle, as they say. Mm-hmm. When I met Fred, it was like he was obviously a cowboy first and a software guy second. Mm-hmm. So we got involved in putting together an angel fund. So Fred wanted to put together an angel fund. I took that on, and the result now is what Tom Simpson's doing.
Yeah,
and really, for a community of this size, and I'm talking about Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, which is maybe approaching 750,000 people.
Probably something like that, yeah.
We really have state-of-the-art funding for
we do.
Startup companies. And it what Tom is doing now relied on what, Fred and Johnny Humphreys and some other guys did, to kind of start spinning it up. So Johnny Humphreys is a guy that was brought here by essentially the old Washington Water Power, which was the angel funding source.
And for those that don't know, that's now Avista.
Avista. They were the source of capital for an early stage company like Itron. Two guys in a garage started it. When Johnny came, he had background at Texas Instruments, I think, and National Semiconductor. He was a successful Silicon Valley guy that the venture guys brought in. And Johnny told me he was going to come here for a few years and get the hell out of town. He's still here. Mm-hmm. I believe it was something like Itron was doing $20 million in sales, losing $5 million a year when they brought Johnny in. So we talk about this, moving to Spokane from other places like Silicon Valley. Johnny found he could hire really good people even then if you paid a Silicon Valley wage in Spokane, because they could live like a king. The problem was, if it didn't work out, somebody that came here, bought a house, made a commitment, and didn't work out, there was no place else to go at the time, because it was a real thin layer of technology here.
When was that?
I think it was around 85, 86, 87.
Oh yeah, so early on.
Yeah, I think Johnny maybe came to the company in 85. So that was a big problem. But now, it's not exactly, a teeming hotbed of technology, but it's come a long way. Yeah. So an engineer that makes the move with a company, if it doesn't work with that company, there are a lot more places to go if it doesn't work out, if you want to stay in the region.
Well, and what do you think too about all the universities have expanded and added programs, and some of them are pretty well acclaimed.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in high school in the 90s, Gonzaga was, for most people, not a consideration of the school. They had really no sports to speak of, and then I went to Washington State University, and it's a little bit bigger than it was then, but it's always been a pretty big school from the back in the day with the I think they called it the land grant universities. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But Gonzaga now I think is 5,000-6,000 students. It's a real deal, and Whitworth has got a lot of acclaim, and then you've got Eastern that's been growing rapidly too. So I think you've got this. There were these pioneers in those fields, and now there are these schools that are bringing people in to teach these curriculums that are
they're needed. So supposedly, and I verified this with talking casually with a lot of people, Eastern for years has had a very well-respected computer science program, very quietly out in Cheney, and I think a number of people were hired into Microsoft in the early days, and made money in the IPO. And they were Eastern guys that came off a farm in Roselia and were kind of wired that way. Became a computer geek, and that's continued from what I understand.
Yeah, I think that that is the case, and I've actually heard that same thing that you just mentioned about Eastern with engineering, that you get a mix at Eastern that isn't prevalent everywhere, which is somebody that actually has some practical knowledge that maybe grew up working with their uncle or their dad and
welding on the combine.
and then went and got their engineering degree. So they have that, not just the book experience or the screen experience. They can actually go out there and go, well, that's not going to work.
Right.
Because this has to spin this way. And instead of
practical
designing
knowledge
it and
is helpful.
So there's a guy, James Creechy, that does a podcast called Irons in the Fire, and he's been going and interviewing a lot of the manufacturing firms in Spokane, doing something to highlight all the stuff that's going on, like Pearson Packaging. A lot of people understand what they're doing with robotics and all that. But some of the other stuff in aerospace and making parts and different things, and they talk about that practical knowledge. And there's a lot of firms like Andy Barrett's Berg facility that have come in and actually did work with Boeing years ago and entered into the Lean Six Sigma process. And I see that in most places with manufacturing where that's kind of been initiated there. And I think it's a trickle-down effect of Spokane being a feeder market at one point in time to the Boeings of the world. And now I see there's some spin-offs in the Spokane area where people are actually creating companies that are building things here and shipping them off other than just parts.
Getting back kind of we were talking about the angel funding. A lot of this is kind of the law of large numbers. I mean, in the Bay Area, have 15 to 20 million people, and you have Stanford and California, and you have kind of this culture of big time entrepreneurialism. We are kind of, I feel like, just big enough because we have manufacturing, we have an airport, and then we have this source of angel funding for early stage startups. It's not the old Washington Water Power, that wouldn't have the bandwidth that we have now. So I think all the pieces are in place. So again, getting back to the guys that stuck through the 80s and 90s and where we are now, it feels like a flywheel is starting to spin up a little bit. Now you never know, because there's the exogenous variable of global economy, national economy, and in a capitalist society there's always booms and busts. But it feels like we can maybe reach another level of growth here. And it's based on not only the things that we have in place and our local entrepreneurs. Instead of trying to recruit people to build a plant here, we've got a Jordan Allen spinning up Stay Alfred here. And a certain amount of the local other companies are funded here, and nurturing these local entrepreneurs, and also showing a place where an outside entrepreneur can maybe come here, build his business, find the capital. So we are at this point where you could see a next leg up.
I think we're setting maybe a new floor. Let's shift gears. We're in the 518 West Riverside building. We've got this really cool coffee shop downstairs, and we're in the Bend and Sway office here, and it's just full of cool spaces, and it's kind of your brainchild, is it not?
Well, it's like anything else. When you talk about guys like Jim Frank that took risk and turned around a neighborhood in Spokane, you've got to talk about Rob Brewster. He was a early adopter of taking old buildings and turning them around, and Dan Spalding down in West Main. I mean, we don't exist in a vacuum here. So might be my brainchild a little bit, but White and Runkle were two entrepreneurs that had a very successful ad agency here, and I think they were early adopters of digital marketing. And they quietly had, Fortune 500 customers, and they spent a lot of time in New York. And they're the guys that converted this building.
Yeah.
Building built in 1890 after the fire. So it's got the cool brick and all that kind of stuff. But it was a schlubby building, I'm sure, before they took it on.
Yeah.
And they're the guys that in 2001 hired a Seattle architect and built the huge, giant skylight. And they filled it with productive people, and they did well. So they're, compensated for taking risk and hiring people. Sold it to a Seattle company that kind of downsized.
Yeah.
But they held on to the real estate. So the real estate was empty, and I had an office just down the block, and we kind of tied it up. They gave us a few terms. I didn't know what we were going to do. So we brought a few people in here, and they looked at the ground floor and hemmed and hawed, and it's easy to talk yourself out of deals. I talked myself out of a couple deals that I want to hit myself over the head with a wrench for not doing them. So I understand that. But it's interesting that Bobby Enslow, the Indaba guy, walked in and was like, this is cool, let's do it.
Yeah.
So, it's this symbiotic relationship between real estate and people that fill the real estate.
Yeah.
Like entrepreneurs that see something and then jump on it.
Yeah.
So you need tenants, you need Bend and Sway. You walked in and kind of had the same approach. Let's do some. I like this. Other people hem and haw. So again, now it looks, if not brilliant, at least a solid B.
Yeah, I think it's great.
But and it's more obvious now than when I had it tied up.
Of course.
Because when White and Runkle owned this building, it was really off limits to everybody. It was kind of like Fort Knox. So it's been here for a long time with the cool skylight and the exposed brick and the exposed beams, but really nobody knew about it. Now that it's a coffee shop, the public gets to share the cool space that White and Runkle put together. Really, and we were a catalyst for upgrading it for now.
Yeah.
So again, what we did, and it took you and the other people that have chipped in to share the risk and hopefully share the upside. It kind of takes a team.
Had you done a project like this before?
Yeah, we did the Globe building down
at
Main and Division, and there again, that used to be Skid Row.
Yeah.
And that was a building that was almost entirely vacant. There was 2 tenants in the building. So we took a risk and we filled it up, but it would have been a lot harder to do 10 years ago than now because of the people that developed that West Main area, like Dan Spalding and Jim Sheehan. And, so again, that's why I don't exactly like to talk about myself.
I think you have to give, be grateful for the people that came before you, paved the way, and they really, the prior generations gave us a pretty good canvas to work with.
You kind of stand on other people's shoulders.
And hopefully, that...
It goes up from here.
People are talking about you and while we're long gone. That would be great.
That would be great, especially if we, built a base for another leg up.
Right.
Yeah.
So, John, with that, there'll be people watching this from the Spokane area and around. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you or talk to you about real estate or business, how would they go about doing that?
509-701-0864. Call me. That's easy enough.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I've really appreciated you being here. Appreciate working with you. It's, I've known your name for a long time because you kind of float in the same circles. And then
but all those felonies have been dropped. All the bad times are behind, and now I'm a solid citizen, so.
Well, from what I can see, you've been since I've known you, so that's good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, John. Appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks, Russ.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.